More than ever, reports the New York Times, Americans do not trust business or the people who run it. The public believes that executives are bent on destroying the environment, cooking the books, and lining their own pockets. That's a quote from the New York Times. A recent Roper poll showed that 72% of respondents felt that wrongdoing was widespread in industry. A whopping 90% told a Harris poll that big companies have too much influence on government. Maybe all that has a little something to do with another inconvenient truth, the nation's gaping wealth gap. For the first time since the Labor Department began crunching the numbers, the top fifth of the population devoured over half the American pie of annual income and owns 83% of all stock. The top 1% owns half of that. Meanwhile, since 2000, median income has fallen almost 6%. To paraphrase Bill Clinton, it's the stupid economy. Or maybe public discontent heated up because while the planet is writhing with paroxysms from global warming, ExxonMobil posted the highest corporate profits in the history of civilization. The other oil giants were not far behind, hot on their heels. Interior Department whistleblowers simultaneously revealed how the oligarchy was systematically hustling the public treasury out of royalties worth hundreds of millions of dollars every year, at the very moment the government is running the highest deficit ever recorded. Meanwhile, while the government claims to export democracy abroad, we seem to be losing it at home, especially when it conflicts with corporate interests. Make no mistake, the policies of the corporate state have seldom stood in such sharp opposition to the ostensible will of the American people. The highly respected Program on International Policy Attitudes contrasted the people's budget against the government's budget. The most dramatic differences were that the public wanted these: deep cuts in defense spending, a significant reallocation toward deficit reduction, and increases in spending on social programs. By far, the biggest percentage increase the public wanted was for conserving and developing renewable energy. Apart from universal health care, energy independence and getting off oil are the public's single highest priority. And as for those famous moral values voters, one Zogby poll probed how the American people prioritize our country's, quote, most urgent moral crisis. Twice as high as any other concerns were greed and materialism at 33% and poverty and economic justice at 31%. Numerous polls show that the democracy deficit is also pitting public policy against the public regarding the government's handling of Katrina, election reform, preemptive war, state torture, and indefinite detentions without trial. So why are the very special interests winning? Tom Linzey says the reason is that corporations have far more rights than people. In fact, the damage caused by a corporate few is treated as entirely legal under our structures of law. And of course, nature has no rights. But all of this may be changing, and in no small measure because of Tom and his allies' very bold efforts. Tom's a Pennsylvania-based attorney who co-founded the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization providing free and affordable legal services to grassroots groups and municipal governments around the country. Tom has shown true genius at devising creative strategies to achieve democratic control over corporations. He's worked with local communities to demand and assert their rights over corporate rights. Almost everyone thought it was impossible. That is, until some local communities started rewriting the rules and winning. Tom is tireless. He's run as an independent candidate for state attorney general in Pennsylvania. He tours relentlessly around the country, talking to groups and municipal governments. But his most recent venture may be his most important contribution yet. Tom and his ally Richard Grossman helped launch democracy schools. These weekend seminars teach strategies to reclaim local sovereignty over key economic decisions that affect communities. Democracy schools are popping up like flowers after a desert rain, equipping thousands of community leaders with effective organizing tools. This work is deeply hopeful because it goes beyond tiresome left-right polarities. What's emerging is a radical center, the universal desire for local control and authentic local democracy to create healthy communities and a healthy environment. Tom Linzey stands in the deeply American lineage of real grassroots democracy. Please give it up for a man who is seeding local democracy across the nation. Tom Linzey.
I get a booster seat, apparently, because I'm so tall. Wow. Thank you, Kenny and Nina, for that introduction. It's good to be back here at Bioneers. And greetings again from Pennsylvania. In 2004 on this stage, I made a joke, or I tried to make a joke, asking what a lawyer could possibly say in 25 minutes. Ever since that talk, and after hundreds of emails, phone calls, and letters from Bioneers attendees, I'm convinced that I was actually able to say something that got people thinking about what this country of ours actually is, and what it's doing to places and people like those in rural Pennsylvania where we work. I think I have an even tougher job this morning, however, because we've learned a lot since 2004, and I'm going to try to share what we've learned in the 24 minutes that I have left. So buckle your seatbelts, and let's get down to business. Inherent in this Bioneers gathering is a recognition of how bad things have gotten on this planet of ours, and how things are rapidly getting worse. Dead zones off the coasts of Washington and Oregon, dying aspen forests in the West, dying salt marshes in New England, not to mention the long-term statistics that always blow my mind. 96% of all forests in the United States have been logged, 38 billion tons of pollutants are pumped into the air annually, half of all plant species and 11,000 animal species on the verge of extinction, 90% of fish populations wiped completely out. It's enough to ruin one's whole day, or a whole decade. In fact, it's even enough to make some of our closest friends simply give up trying to do anything about anything. They've decided to just wait for the crash. Which all begs the question, why isn't our work working? Why aren't our cumulative efforts having an impact? It's certainly not for lack of trying. After all, in the environmental community especially, we've created environmental laws, launched an alphabet soup of regulatory agencies, and raised public consciousness on environmental issues across the board. Above all, of course, we worship the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, mining laws, and others as the high point of our work. Over the past decade, we've seen those laws up close and personal, even attempted to enforce some of them. But what do they really do? Well, they regulate mining, land development, waste management, and disposal. They regulate emissions into the air and water. In other words, they regulate the level of harm and amount of poisons that can be legally injected into our water, soil, and air. Regulating, of course, assumes that the injection will take place. In the words of Webster's, to regulate means simply to, quote, adjust the rate or flow. By issuing permits, regulatory agencies legalize those injections, hence the noun permit, or the verb to permit. Indeed, the injection would be illegal in the absence of the permit. It should come then as no surprise that the first regulatory agencies were actually established, in the words of U.S. Attorney General Richard Olney in the 1890s, so that regulatory agencies and regulations could become a, quote, sort of barrier between corporations and the people, and a sort of protection against hasty and crude legislation hostile to corporations. Certainly not the history that we learn in law school, or the history that communities under attack desperately want to believe. In addition to becoming expert regulators, we've labeled ourselves as consumers in the belief that we can change the actions of those who run this country by buying the right stuff. We've labeled ourselves as investors in the belief that if we put our money in the right places, we can reverse the course that this nation is on. Each of those categories, us as regulators, us as consumers, us as investors, have one thing in common. They all relinquish, without a thought or a fight, our sovereign right to use the law to stop that which is harming us. Instead, we invest our time and resources in begging corporations and governmental agencies to cause a little less harm. Or as writer Derek Jensen puts it much more eloquently than I, quote, "Does anyone really believe that Weyerhaeuser Corporation is going to stop deforesting because we ask nicely? Does anyone really believe that Monsanto Corporation will stop Monsantoing because we ask nicely? If only we get a Democrat in the White House, things will be okay. If only we pass this or that piece of legislation, things will be okay. If only we defeat this or that piece of legislation, things will be okay." Nonsense, Jensen writes. Things will not be okay. They are already not okay, and they're getting worse rapidly, end quote. So after 40 years of perfecting our roles as regulators, consumers, and investors, we have very little to show for it. By almost every major environmental statistic, things are worse now than they've ever been. Clearly, our work isn't working. After ceding our authority to decide whether the Monsanto or Weyerhaeuser Corporation will tinker with genetic codes of life or buzzsaw their way through old-growth forest ecosystems, and exchanging it for a regulatory process that assumes that they will, but merely regulates how fast, the wonder is not that things have gotten worse, but that things aren't worse than they are. So why has our activism failed so miserably? To not only build the world that we want, but even to draw a line in the sand to keep things from getting worse. Perhaps it is because our activism is built tooth and nail on one critical and most times completely unquestioned assumption. That unquestioned assumption, a box within which we've constructed our activism over the past 4 decades, is the assumption that we actually live in a democracy. That is, we assume that we live in a country where it actually matters what majorities of people think and want, where it actually matters what a majority of people within a given community think and want. It is that assumption that hardwires our organizing. The assumption that the fundamental governing structure under which we live actually recognizes and is dictated by the will of majorities. It is that assumption that determines that our activism will be sufficient if we merely perfect our roles as regulators, consumers, and investors. That if we just get enough people to write letters to Congress, that if we just get enough people to attend a hearing or protest, that if we just get enough people to buy the right stuff or invest in the right stuff, that will force those who actually run this country to reverse course. In other words, in assuming that we live in a democracy, we mistakenly tailor our strategies and our tactics towards mobilizing people in the same tired old ways that have now failed for close to half a century. Perhaps, just perhaps, we're in this mess today, not only because we don't live in a democracy, but we find ourselves in this mess because we've never had a democracy in this country. Indeed, perhaps the corporate cultural IV in our arms has been working so well that it's hard for us to even imagine what self-government would look like. As a result, we tangle ourselves further each year by continuing to define the nature of the problems we face as the projects themselves that we seek to oppose. Thus, we define the problem as aerial herbicide spraying in Alaska, or a toxic waste incinerator being built in Ohio, or sewage sludge being dumped in Berks County, Pennsylvania. In defining the problem as the project itself, we then gather people who care, or we work to convince people that they should care, in the belief that if we just mobilize enough people, that the decision makers will take note and the project will be stopped. In short, we assume that it matters, that community majorities don't want the spraying incinerators or sludge. We therefore assume that we're working within a framework in which majorities actually make governing decisions. After all, that's what we've been taught to believe. High-sounding phrases roll off the tongues of judges and legislators like consent of the governed and majority rule. Yet, as we know, it doesn't quite work that way. Community majorities are overridden on a daily basis. Regulatory agencies legalize projects and actions that communities don't want. Zoning and land use ordinances are routinely overridden by judicial doctrines like the fair share doctrine, in which courts can throw out zoning and land use ordinances if those laws don't allow for the community's fair share of development as compared to communities next door. Local laws are routinely nullified that conflict with state and federal laws. And when communities really try to practice democracy and refuse to swallow what they've been given, corporate managers write new preemptive laws and use the state legislatures to nullify community lawmaking. When state legislatures get out of hand, they use the federal government to preempt the state legislature. When national governments get out of hand, they use international trade agreements to preempt them. Corporate managers using the courts to override communities avail themselves of a bunch of legal doctrines that seem to be manufactured by the day. Things like limited liability, state actor, in which corporations can't legally be held responsible for violating the constitutional rights of people, the permit shield defense, the requirement that communities exhaust administrative remedies, and on and on and on. In addition to wielding the legislatures and the courts to hold uppity communities down, corporate managers control and define our culture, even down to the very language that we use. I'm happy to announce that we no longer have factory farms in Pennsylvania. We now have advanced and modern farming. We don't have land-applied sewage sludge anymore either. We have biosolids that are being recycled. All thanks to lots of our tax dollars paid to public relations corporations by our state government. Why use corporate resources to mess with the language? Because the language then protects the system of minority rule by making it appear that the outcomes of that system are beneficial. Plus, it's that much easier for judges and legislators to strike down local laws that interfere with those beneficial outcomes. After all, who could be against modern and advanced farms? Who could be against progress, efficiency? Welcome to what some have coined a corporate state, in which our own governmental institutions, language, and even our brains are wielded against our own best interests, in which a corporate few wield preemptive legal power against the rest of us. A question we get asked by folks in rural Pennsylvania who regularly butt their heads up against this seeming paradox is a common one. Where did this system come from? Which leads to the second question, which is, knowing how this system actually works, what do we do about it now? Answering the first question for our folks in rural Pennsylvania required a decade's worth of detective work. And a lot of it has led to what for some, even at Bioneers, may be a surprising, even shocking history. One of the first things that led folks to ask those questions was running into a body of law, property law, that consistently stopped them from outright banning factory farms from siting in their communities. And so to find out why they were being stopped, we began to peel back some history, which led us to the common law of property, or English law. In the United States, our structure of law, of course, is actually an English one. Looking a little deeper, we discovered that the highest role that English law served, especially in the 1600s and 1700s, its seminal period of development, was to enable the English empire to expand, which necessarily meant also stifling dissenting majorities at home. It was that system of law that was used in the words of authors Peter Linebaugh and Marcus Rediker in a book called The Many-Headed Hydra. Quote, to whip, dismember, brand, hang, and burn the diggers, the levelers, the Quakers, the ranters, the Muggletonians, and others who struggled to assert their civil rights and stop the enclosures of public lands in the 1600s. It should come as no surprise that protecting the growth of the empire required that the English structure of law forcefully protect property and commerce over the rights of people, while protecting the centralized authority of the king and a small number of nobles. Indeed, it was that very system of law that crossed the Atlantic to provide a structure of law for the early American colonies, which began mainly, of course, as private English corporations. In the words of King Charles II in his grant of a little piece of land called Pennsylvania to William Penn, those corporations were created to, quote, enlarge our English empire, as also to reduce the savage natives by gentle and just manners to the love of civil society and Christian religion. In other words, to shoot them. What wasn't so clear to me, at least, was how that structure of law became like a dead hand from the past, ending up insulating agribusiness corporations and the small number of people running them against community majorities in rural Pennsylvania today. To my surprise, it turned out that the only thing jettisoned by the American Revolution was the king. This English structure of law, on the other hand, was heartily embraced by those drafting the U.S. Constitution, many of whom were lawyers, of course, in the finest English traditions, who revered English law. And so that body of law, forged in the fires of expanding an empire while protecting minority rule at home, was thus hardwired into the fundamental governing document of this country, the U.S. Constitution. Now, that's an astonishing proposition to some, but not to our folks in Pennsylvania, who are being hit upside the head with that structure of law on a daily basis. Something in that proposition has made deep sense to them, especially when they listen to what some of the founding fathers had to say about it. Listen to James Madison, generally regarded as the architect of the Constitution, who bluntly stated, quote, our government ought to secure the permanent interests of the country against innovation. It ought to be so constituted as to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Madison, again, quote, the states ought to be placed under the control of the general government, at least as much so as they were formerly under the King and British Parliament, end quote. In the minutes of the Constitutional Convention, John Dickinson even speechified, quote, that a limited monarchy is one of the best governments in the world, end quote. Now, Dickinson was an ass, even if he was from Pennsylvania. One would expect no more from him, but the fact is no one in the convention even rose to challenge his assertion. The minutes of the convention also reveal that Virginia, in which 280,000 of the total population of 700,000 were slaves, by anyone's definition a slave state, actually wrote the framework for the Constitution. That framework included a clause requiring the federal government to send in the army to put down slave rebellions in the states, and a 3/5 clause which locked slave masters in the South into majority control over Congress and the selection of the president. And of course, African Americans, women, indentured servants, native peoples, and others were not people under the Constitution. They had no civil or political rights whatsoever. It's worth envisioning what the Constitution might have looked like if it had been drafted by the people who were not considered people at the time. For our purposes in rural Pennsylvania, the Constitution enshrined the rights of property and commerce over the rights of people and communities through the Commerce Clause, which now serves to empower corporations to strike down any community or state laws that the courts define as interstate commerce. The courts tell us that garbage is interstate commerce, that corporate pork production is interstate commerce, that cell phone towers are interstate commerce, and that production and distribution of toxics are interstate commerce. Under the Commerce Clause, exercising local democratic control over those industries can not only get you sued, but forced to pay future lost profits to waste agribusiness, telecommunications, and other corporations. In addition to the Commerce Clause, the Constitution now shields corporations under the First Amendment's free speech protections, thus enabling corporate advertising to frame issues before anyone even decides to run for office. Shields corporations from surprise regulatory inspections as unreasonable searches and seizures under the Fourth Amendment. Requires governments to pay corporations for the impact of health and safety laws under the Fifth Amendment. And now cloaks corporations with the fundamental rights and protections of equal protection and due process under the 14th Amendment. It's no wonder that some anti-federalists challenging the ratification of the Constitution itself in the late 1700s declared that the plan of governance it set forth was nothing less than, quote, a plan for a global economic empire that would commence in a moderate aristocracy, eventually swallowing up every other government on the continent. Late 1700s. So what does all of that have to do with the mess that we're in today? As it turns out, everything. Whenever we try to fix the mess, we run not only into our courts, the legislatures, and our culture being wielded by a corporate minority against us, we also run smack into the ultimate trump card, the Constitution itself. In 2004, I stood on this stage and told a Bioneers crowd how 100 small, rural, conservative Pennsylvania townships, targeted for hog factory farms in their communities, had begun to take aim directly at the 4 corporations that control over 65% of pork production in the United States. I told the story of how those communities reframed the problem away from the air and water pollution and property devaluation caused by factory farms. Indeed, away from factory farms themselves, reframing the problem as the corporatization of agriculture and the elevation of the rights of those corporations over the rights of those communities. I told the story of how some of those communities followed the lead of 9 Midwestern states and began passing laws banning agribusiness corporations from farming. In essence, prohibiting those corporations and the few who run them from defining what farming would look like within those communities. In a very real way, they acted to replace corporate minority decision-making with community self-government. I told the story of other communities who watched as 2 children died in Pennsylvania after being exposed to land-applied sewage sludge, and who began passing local laws that prohibited sludge corporations from operating in their communities. Altogether, over 300,000 people are now living under new governing frameworks we've drafted with them in Pennsylvania. In passing those laws, all of those communities have crossed a line that has been carefully etched by a corporate minority who have used the law to place all real decision-making and thus all real governing beyond the authority of we the people. I can still remember a meeting several years ago in which one of our elected officials, in response to the town lawyer who had just informed him that the township was powerless to stop sludge from being dumped, pulled out the Pennsylvania Constitution from his desk and read the words from Article 1, Section 2. Quote, "All power is inherent in the people, and all free governments are founded on their authority and instituted for their peace, safety, and happiness." End quote. To which I found myself explaining to him that those wonderful words have been rendered meaningless, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the grandest work of the people gathered in that small building in central Pennsylvania that night would be to make those words real again. One thing we've learned, however, during our tromping across Pennsylvania over the last 8 years is that it's extremely difficult for the people to hear the proposition that we don't have a democracy, and thus the proposition that under this system it is perfectly legal for a small number of people within a corporation to override whole communities. After all, one evening of discussion can only do so much to untangle a life's worth of assumptions. And so another tenet of this organizing was born, the understanding that although people can't hear it, that they can certainly see it when it happens in front of them in their own communities. And so 6 years ago, in the most rural parts of Pennsylvania, the seeing it began. As they watched, people in those communities saw the Pennsylvania legislature work overtime on behalf of the agribusiness industry, drafting state legislation to preempt the anti-corporate farming and anti-corporate sludge ordinances communities had adopted. For over 5 years, those communities joined hands with each other to stop those bills aimed at nullifying their local laws. In support, our organization led a statewide coalition of environmental, labor, municipal, and farm groups to run interference for those communities. Together, we successfully kept that Republican-driven legislation from becoming law each session from 2000 to 2005. All of that changed, however, when a liberal Democrat from Philadelphia became Pennsylvania's governor. Governor Eddie Rendell, quickly known in our circles as Fast Eddie, pulled something off that even the Republicans couldn't for those 5 years. He put together a coalition of legislators that passed a bill even worse than the bills we had beaten back. His bill authorized the Pennsylvania Attorney General to sue our local townships to overturn their ordinances. 5 months ago, the Attorney General filed the first lawsuits against 4 townships under Rendell's law. Now, when the power and authority of the state, from the governor's office to the Attorney General's office to the offices of their legislators, all join together to override lawmaking by majorities, it doesn't take belief in a Tom Linzey or a Richard Grossman to figure out that something is fundamentally illegitimate in a system which our own governmental institutions are almost always on the side of property, commerce, and corporations, and almost never on the side of local control, rights, communities, and nature. That structure can't be deemed a democracy. It can, however, be rightly defined as a corporate state. The prospect that we actually live in a corporate state and not a democracy is dawning on community leaders and elected officials across rural Pennsylvania. It makes a lot of sense in a way. You can't regulate, consume, or invest your way out of a corporate state, precisely because those forms of activism do nothing to challenge the underlying structure of law. Going to skip some because we're running out of time here. All to say, we have 100 communities in Pennsylvania who have passed local laws essentially challenging agribusiness and sludge corporations from running their communities. 2 years ago, we started a new type of work to put in place new generation ordinances that fundamentally challenge the structure of law and the U.S. Constitution. Okay. Perhaps as importantly, those new ordinances also contain a provision which requires the municipality, upon any attempt by a corporation to preempt the ordinance, to consider formally separating from the county, state, or federal government. People are taking self-governance very seriously in the Keystone State, and they're inviting you to get serious with them. One thing Kenny mentioned in my introduction that I'm going to close is that this is a time for hope. I think I disagree slightly with that. Okay? I think it's time actually to give up hope. Okay? Our folks in Pennsylvania have given up hope that the legislature will help them, that the courts will help them, that environmental groups will help them, or that state agencies will help them. Instead, they've turned to the same place that the abolitionists and suffragists turned, to the same place that the populist farmers of the 1890s and the American revolutionaries turned, to themselves and to each other. Giving up hope that someone else will save them, thus is becoming a beginning and not an end. And Derek Jensen, I think, puts it much more eloquently than I in an article he wrote called Beyond Hope. Quote, "A wonderful thing happens when you give up on hope, which is that you realize that you never needed it in the first place. You realize that giving up on hope didn't kill you. It didn't even make you less effective. In fact, it made you more effective because you ceased relying on someone or something else to solve your problems. You ceased hoping your problems would somehow get solved through the magical assistance of God, the Great Mother, the Sierra Club, valiant tree sitters, brave salmon, or even the earth itself. And you just begin doing whatever it takes to solve those problems yourself. When you give up on hope, something even better happens than it not killing you, which is that in some sense, it does kill you. You die. And there's a wonderful thing about being dead, which is that those in power, can't really touch you anymore. Not through promises, not through threats, not through violence itself. When you give up on hope, you turn away from fear, and when you quit relying on hope and instead begin to protect the people, things, and places you love, you become very dangerous indeed to those in power. In case you're wondering, Jensen writes, giving up hope can be a very good thing. Thank you.